Good morning, everybody. For those who have been here yesterday, we proposed to start a bit earlier this morning to catch up on an important topic that we did not have time the days before enough. So we use this time until 9:30, where we officially start the program for today. So I will just hand over to Frank to moderate this and come back in 20 minutes then.
Me, yes, but you, no.
Hallo? Het is een één dat heeft. Just talk. Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And yes, we sort of rescheduled scheduled an early start this morning just to look again at the information we had on the land sector. And I think Giacomo's online and Maria is here. So we won't go back to the slides, but just Maria, could you briefly outline the key points that you raised with respect to the different analysis sources that are out there in terms of understanding the, I suppose, the land sink and the challenges in that?
Well, I guess I can summarize in 3 points. The first point is that we have still limited knowledge about how biological systems work, particularly complex systems. And for example, forests are a very key ecosystem that we are appealing to mitigate climate change and to compensate some of the emissions. But we know very little about how adult forests behave and how they will respond to the disturbances that climate change is providing. And either models or some of the measurements we have in history have a very limited capacity to predict. So either way, the trends that we observe, they will change, and we don't know exactly how. And the models are based on the processes they thought were regulating those historical trends, and therefore it's very likely that they won't be able to predict the behavior, in particular when you introduce very frequent disturbances. So I think that's one point. The second point is that obviously, and also reflecting upon what it was yesterday during the CDR sessions, we are relying on the capacity of the plant ecosystems and the vegetation to absorb CO2 and even react in a much more efficient manner to absorb this CO2, because the CO2 is increasing in the atmosphere. And that is true so far. But we don't know when this will be breakdown. And I think we need to bring more people that understands better how the physiology and the biochemistry works, because it is reasonable to think that if those systems have been evolving for thousands of years under much lower CO2 concentrations, they have a saturation point that if it's reached, they will probably provide some unexpected results. So that's my second point. And the third point is that I think we have to work together. I mean, obviously, for managing land ecosystems, you have to measure, you have to track, you have to be able to regularly understand the trends of those ecosystems. And I think we are in a point where it's important that we don't decouple the mitigation expectations from the adaptation needs on those systems. There is no doubt that you can be very optimistic in getting a large amount of sinks from forests, for example, but you need to think about how to protect them because the negative influence of climate change through extreme events and also through changing some key climatic variables is going to overcome probably this capacity. So I think my conclusion is that first we need to make sure that all the communities work together on increasing the understanding of what is happening and what could happen, and not try to sort of fight to each other about who has the best numbers, because the numbers are not telling us any sensible thing at the moment, but rather understanding what are the risks that we are facing by relying excessively on land sinks. And for that, I think some steps are being made. I think the conversation that is starting between the inventory compilers, which are the ones that are getting the data for actually the policymakers to decide how policies will be shaped, and the modeling community is improving. And I think we have to open our eyes and be able to have the multiple possible outcomes that models can give, but based on all possible scenarios, including the constraints that we have on how the information is archived and used when you are managing those ecosystems, which is, in our case, the GSG inventories. And my final point is, I don't understand this obsession about separating direct and indirect effects. I mean, what the atmosphere sees is the trend. And I think what we need to understand is how our management can influence this trend. And for that, we need systematic observation. And we need to be sure that we can do these observations by comparing different types of management. And I was very pleased to hear yesterday also the ICOS intervention showing that we have much more information and much more capacity probably to do so.
Okay, thank you, Maria. And Giacomo, I see you online as well. Giacomo, you gave us a very stark numbers in terms of talking to the experts who you brought together in the GRC, and 50% of them thought that terrestrial systems were a sink, and 50% thought they were a source. That struck me as quite an interesting outcome. But could you, just like Maria, could you just refresh us on the key points that you raised about the lack of it doesn't add up in terms of the various analyses that are happening out there and how you're trying to address that?
So thank you. I will summarize, complementing what Maria just said, that I agree with. So we have seen that there is this large mismatch due to different definitions. We have, as a matter of fact, two communities that have been working for 20 years on the same topics, but didn't talk each other. We started a dialogue. We're starting a dialogue that will be a long process, so don't expect result on immediate terms. What I would say is that, first of all, we have this mismatch, but the first message is keep calm, in the sense that this mismatch creates confusion that has something that we have to fix. But it doesn't undermine the value of, for example, of country mitigation effort, first of all, on fossil fuel, but also on land-related emission and deforestation. Second, we need to translate, we need to understand each other. The word translation came as a consensus from the IPC meeting in Ispra, because it gives the impression that reminds that we have two languages, and two languages by definition have the similar dignity. There is no one better than the other. So we have to translate to understand each other. In this translation, there is one community that is more flexible than the other, and these are the global models results. So the global models can be operationally translated into a language that is more understandable by the national inventory compilers, and this is what we will ask the next IPC cycle to do. At the same time, national inventories, in the context of the already existing IPC guidance and UNFCCC requirements, could improve a lot their inventory as part of the continuous improvement process they are expected to pursue, and especially with regard to transparency. For example, transparency in the definition of managed land, transparency in disaggregating as much as possible the land so that the drivers can be more clear. To some extent, this may help also to understand to what extent direct and indirect effects are captured. The full distinction cannot be done in the same way as models do. So I would say translate mainly is a message mostly from models. Transparency is a message for all, but I would remark that is a work. I mean, the national inventory have a lot of potential improvement to do there. And finally, communicate implications, because any translation from models result to country will come up with implications for the remaining carbon budget and net zero years. As mentioned yesterday, the carbon budget will be reduced at global level, but even net zero will not be enough anymore to stabilize temperature. So if countries will maintain their approach to estimate land sink, and there is no other say feasible option to change, well, these the consequences of that should be somehow reflected in the climate ambition. So keep this dialogue open. So the keywords are translation, communication and implication, and transparency. These are somehow the keywords I see.
Thank you very much, Giacomo. Just to follow up briefly, you're obviously talking about at a global level, but in Europe, and I suppose going back to the community here in JPI Climate, is there things that we can do to assist that translation process? Maybe I'll just leave you.
I didn't. The sounds was interrupted. Could you repeat?
I'll try. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
I suppose you brought together the global community, but I suppose JPI Climate and our partners bring together the European community. So I'm just wondering, from a European perspective, is there something that we can do to help in that translation process, as you called it, at a European scale? And I'm sitting in front of one of the key people from ICOS, who obviously, as Maria said, observation systems are probably the landing ground for doing a lot of the work here. So if you have any suggestions for development, just feel free to articulate them.
The health observation was also represented at the PC meeting. They are providing estimates to both community, the other community, the global models, and national inventory, somehow can be the broker of this community. So I would say follow the debate. I think the translation have to be done by the global modeling community, both for historical period and for the scenario. For the historical period, in the global carbon budget, the translation is becoming operational. For the future is a bit less straightforward. So there is need to invest from the CMIP 7, I would say, on translating, in providing scenarios and their translation into the national inventory language. So this is a research, an area of where future research has to take into account these requests, this need to provide a scenario also in the language of the country. And then the situation for Europe, this mismatch is a bit less pronounced than in other part of the world. But still, looking at the implication of the translation is something that is an information that is worth to be communicated to policymakers, and then it's up to them to decide.
Please.
I think because there is a large concentration of modeling community in Europe that is being providing many of the inputs to the global estimations, there is a chance that we can steer in Europe this thinking faster. let's say, so that the IAMS modeling community and also the climate modelers, because I think that we don't forget the climate modelers and how land interacts with the climate predictions. In Europe, we should promote some gathering of the European modeling community to steer this process faster. That I think it could be a contribution, because at the moment there is few spaces where this can be done. And the research is extremely fragmented. So the possibility of ensuring that there is a broader gathering on those communities in the spaces where they can discuss first what they want to do, I think is a very important point that Europe can be steered.
Okay, is there any questions from the floor on this one? I'm looking for the famous cube. In the meantime, I see Miles. Yeah, just I suppose one of the things we can do from this meeting is to, I suppose, articulate the issue, and hopefully we'll have that as part of the report from this meeting, so that we have a document that sort of, I suppose, puts some meaningful way to communicate it outside the sort of groups who are specialists to the outside community. But Miles, you want to say something?
Thank you. Yes, and thanks for that intervention, Giacomo, and apologies for being late, Maria. I was slightly muddled this time. We were starting this morning, but I'm just picking up on this conversation. I think it's very important to say, yes, at the global level, it's a matter of translation. You're obviously right there, Giacomo. But I think it's important to be clear with people that the different languages have different implications at a national level, as a subglobal level. And the example we keep coming back to is, can Russia declare itself net zero already? I mean, and technically the answer to that is, if they use the inventory language, the answer is yes, or at least pretty close. Canada certainly could. And would a future government of Canada decide they've achieved net zero and they're joining the G0 club of Suriname, Guyana, and so on, and they're done? I mean, this is, I think, it needs to be appreciated. This is not just a matter of translation. It does have policy implications.
Yeah, thank you very much, Miles. I think Giacomo was coming back to address your point there. So.
No, just to confirm that I agree with what Miles said. There are policy implications that have to be communicated, and actually could be the most difficult part of this discourse, because translation is about technical, reaggregation of data in the simplest way, or a greater integration of models to follow the inventory approach. And it's doable, can be improved, but it's doable. The most difficult part is communicating the implication. And I agree with Miles that this has to move from the global level, but also we have to go at a country level. Bear in mind that I like the IPCC mantra of being policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. The scientists are the navigation system of the car that I mentioned yesterday, not the autopilot. But having said that, I fully agree with Miles that we have to go also at country level discussion.
Yeah, that's right. We need to look into the countries. And if you look into Canada, for example, Canada was unable to fulfill the Kyoto Protocol commitments because they got a disturbance in their forest. They were counting to be the saviors of their commitment. So I think at the country level, you have to develop simple narratives that give the policymaker the understanding that the risk they are having not to fulfill their commitments is extremely high at the moment. And then, of course, we can work on explaining much more the implications in terms of how accounting works with respect to what the actual fluxes are, and so on and so on. But I think, for me, the more convincing argument at the moment to be cautious about how you account for biological sinks is actually the risk. This extremely high risk,
just we have unusually an online intervention here. I think it's Daniela Jacobs. Daniela, you wanted to join this conversation, so please.
Yeah, Frank, thank you very much, and for this unusual option for me. But I do think it is a really great discussion which you're having, and I joined unfortunately only parts of it the last 2 days. But what I would like to strengthen here, I think we are always talking on the national level or international level. However, I do think that the knowledge about the importance of the ecosystem services or the ecosystem functioning to the, I would say, greater public is of extreme importance, because as Miles said, the biological things, and as we just discussed, are so important for the future, but this is not really in the awareness of the local decision making. And I think it is, in addition to the national and international accounting and policy, it's very important to connect this to the competing land use discussions on the local and regional level. So I would suggest that we include this smaller scales or local levels into the activities and into the dialogues. Thanks.
Yeah, Daniela, this is a very good point, because the ones that we are starting to do that at the local level, what we are discovering, which is not a surprise if you think with common sense, is that basically on the local level, there are different priorities. You have to find which is the priority that will trigger the action that sometimes is not carbon sequestration, but carbon sequestration is a side effect, right? So for example, in the Mediterranean, carbon sequestration is not the driver of action. The driver of action is water cycle protection. So I think at the local level, what you cannot be simplistic. You cannot go and say carbon sequestration is the mantra for all of you. You need to find what are the priorities. And then I fully agree that we have to think more holistically on what is the territorial vision we want to have, and the competing, and this cannot be done at the global level. You cannot have global pathways that everyone can follow simplistically, right? Every single local scale where action can be implemented through policies, through subsidies, through support, needs to define their own pathways. And the problem we have now is how we make these bottom-up complexities coherent with the global trends we want to steer. But I will never move farmers in the Mediterranean through carbon. Never. Right?
But the point...
And this is why, for example, in the Common Agricultural Policy, the greening is not being successful. They have different leverage to move forward. And this is what we need to find together. And I think the global community has his role, but now is the time for the local action, and this is far more complex. We can use tools that the global community is using, but we cannot downscale global models to local. That's impossible. So, yeah.
Can I just add one point? I do think at the local level, the awareness of the importance of the sink function is not there. So it's not part of the entire discussion. And I think that needs to be strengthened.
I don't think that's true, but anyway, we can discuss that on the side.
Okay, let's I'll leave that discussion. I see Zoltan, you wanted to say something. Miles, could you pass back the cube?
Yes, thank you very much. I very much like the introductory presentations and fully agree with them. Just 3 points to add, perhaps. One is that, perhaps to María José, that it's perfectly right that we don't fully understand natural processes and they are not necessarily well represented in models. But I would say that also management effects and management processes are not well understood and not well represented. Many models have very unrealistic expectations and we know better. So there's more knowledge out there already that for the taking is just not incorporated because it's perhaps too difficult or too complex, but a lot of progress could be made there. The other thing is that land is very tricky, partly because we make implicit assumptions even if we don't explicitly address it. So not doing something or trying to leave it out and just modeling the technosphere, so to say, is not a solution, because there are inherent connections, for instance, through bioenergy and other things, which is still the biggest source of renewables. They contain inherent assumptions about how land functions and reacts, both naturally and to management. So we can't avoid addressing these things, because even if we don't address them, they are implicitly being taken into account for better or worse. So that is a concern I believe we have to improve there. And the third one is to Daniela. I fully agree with her. And it's not just downscaling spatially, but whatever is being discussed in the IPCC, for instance, national level, I mean, we take the inventories or we take the top-down modeling, and many of the results, many of the approaches are translated into project-based assumptions, methodologies, and all that. And that's not necessarily territorial, but like actions. And then the impacts are not necessarily translatable. So when you want to assess the impact of a certain intervention in a certain area, you have to have some sort of a consequential life cycle analysis approach. And that is something that is often missing and substituted by whatever on the same issue the global approaches say. And that can be misleading. It gives the wrong ideas. And this kind of using the good results out of context is very common. And I think it is something that we have to keep in mind.
Okay, thanks, Sultan. I appreciate those points. I see Miles, you want to come back in again. Just Maria, I just on that point with Daniela, I think in Ireland at least, this whole concept of carbon farming is generating an awful lot of interest in carbon beyond the boundaries of the norm among the rural communities. So I wonder why you think that wouldn't be the case in the Mediterranean.
I think, and buying a little bit the argument of Daniela, that the awareness, because awareness is sometimes confused with communication. Awareness is something else. Awareness is when the need to protect something comes from actually the roots of who is managing this. The carbon farming, indeed, is just the opposite. I mean, it's giving expectations to farmers that probably won't be able to fulfill, and putting farmers in situations which could be very delicate, with not enough information about the implications of the carbon farming. So in Spain, what we are observing is that they are very confused. Either way, they think they can sell carbon into the markets directly, or they can get prices of carbon, which in the land sector is going to be impossible. So it's adding confusion to a very complex setting. So my recommendation is always that when they ask me, it's always like, I mean, sit down. What are your priorities? How in your priorities fits the idea of protecting the carbon that you have or increasing the carbon sink? Is biodiversity a priority for you? You are in an area where the water is an issue. I mean, you cannot go to farmers with a very single, narrow aspect. You have to. You want to create awareness. You go to farmers in the way they have been managing their ecosystems, which is holistically. I mean, we think farmers are idiots. No, the farmers are not idiots. They are the sector which adapts faster, right? So I think we have to be conscious about that. And carbon farming is not being conscious about that, I'm afraid, right? And the way it's been promoted.
Yeah. Okay. No, we'll have to bring this to a close soon. But Miles, you wanted to say something additional?
I just wanted to connect two statements that were made. So, Maria, you sort of commented on some of our obsession with separating the indirect from the direct effect, or the passive from the active response. And I just want to, if you're going to do life cycle analysis at a project level, as Zoltan suggested, you have to make that distinction. If there's any, only if there is any equation or implied equation between fossil fuel emissions and land uptake. Now, of course, I would completely agree with you if we separate geological carbon completely from biological carbon, and I think that's ultimately the only outcome. And so, hence, the disaggregated accounting call in our paper.
Okay.
That was Miles' always a proposal by many of us, not mix these two things. We are going to get in trouble. And that's what we are, in trouble now, right? So I don't know if it's still time to separate them, but I fully agree, because this obsession on separation comes from this. But at the end, what you want is to manage to change the fluxes. And I mean, and a farmer doesn't care. Tell them how to can improve the management to change the fluxes. That's what they care. They don't care about if it's direct, indirect, and even the governments do not care about that. But I think the solution is very simple, as you also say, no?
Okay. Obviously, this conversation could go on. I do think the Kyoto Protocol has a lot to answer for in terms of how it tries to slice and dice the components of the terrestrial system. And what we do is we try to capture this, and obviously we look forward to incorporating your material into the report from this event. And I think with that, I think we should go back to our existing schedule. And thank you, Giacomo, for joining us, and thank you, Daniela, for intervening as well. And thank you, Maria, for your insights, which are always very valuable. Okay.
Bye-bye.